For this segment, I wanted to pick some movies that are maybe a little bit under the radar, at least for some people. And this is especially true for some of the newer films on the list. We're going to be going in chronological order. So we're not going to be talking about Christmas Vacation, Christmas Story, It's a Wonderful Life, films like that. They're a little bit more well known. But up first, we do have another lesser known Jimmy Stewart Christmas movie, The Shop Around the Corner. If you're a film buff like me, or you're of a certain age, you probably have at least heard of this movie. If not, you're probably familiar with its remake, the 1998 smash hit You've Got Mail with Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan. Released in 1940, the original version stars Jimmy Stewart and Margaret Sullivan. A little bit of spoiler territory here. If you've seen You've Got Mail, the premise is basically the same. Two bitter rivals working in the same industry unwittingly fall in love with each other as pseudonymous pen pals. But the setting is totally different in this movie than You've Got Mail. It's set in Budapest in the period in 1940, or at least around that time. I don't think they actually say the exact year, but somewhere in the past. And Stewart and Sullivan are nemesis clerks working together in the same store. They hate each other's guts. They're always bickering. It's essentially a romantic comedy, but with a hefty dose of dramatic meat, particularly with this infidelity and attempted suicide plot line that centers around the owner of the shop, played by the Wizard of Oz himself, Frank Morgan, great actor. The only criticism I have of the film is Sullivan's character, who is totally unlikable. And this is something the filmmakers corrected with You've Got Mail, because Meg Ryan's character is just fantastic. And I think she's actually more likable than Tom Hanks' character in that movie. But in Shop Around the Corner, it's reversed and taken to an extreme. You love Jimmy Stewart's character, but you hate Margaret Sullivan's character. And at the very end of the movie, Sullivan has a couple of lines that try to explain away why she was acting so terrible throughout the film, and that her real personality is the one that shines through her letters. But I don't really buy it. It seems a little forced, a little shoehorned there in at the end. But that criticism aside, it's got all the heart and all the humor needed for a great Christmas film, and it all concludes satisfactorily on Christmas Eve. It's a solid 9 out of 10 movie for me. It's geared more toward adults, but since it is a 1940s picture, the adult themes are handled delicately. There's nothing graphic in the movie, and the infidelity, suicide plot line might prompt some questions from the kids, so if you're a parent, you might want to check it out first before you let the youngsters watch it. But if you love classic Christmas movies and you haven't seen this one, definitely give it a watch. Next, the 1984 A Christmas Carol. I am a Charles Dickens fanatic. I've been working my way through his complete works for the last 8 years. I've read all of his major works, and I'm into the minors, the short stories. I wrote my graduate thesis proposal on Dickens's prose style, although I didn't end up pursuing the thesis because I switched majors midstream. But anyway, I love Dickens. A Christmas Carol is the greatest Christmas story outside the Nativity itself, as far as I'm concerned. And it's been adapted on screen at least 50 million times. Everybody has their favorite. I haven't seen every version of A Christmas Carol, but of the ones I've seen, my favorite by far is the 1984 rendition. It stars the indomitable George C. Scott as Scrooge. Just an incredible job. It was actually a TV movie, but the production value is so high. I had watched it like 20 times before I found out it wasn't a theatrical release that had been panned and scanned to fit TV. It's basically a page-to-screen adaptation, and it's competently directed by Clive Donner. And Scott is essentially reprising his George Patton role for Scrooge. And that may sound weird, but it is actually glorious. It works perfectly for the character. The supporting cast is strong, and most importantly, it captures the spirit and never loses the point of the original novella. Two minor criticisms. because it is a TV production, is shot in a 4:3 aspect ratio. I would have loved to have seen this shot in a widescreen format. It's also very difficult to translate the Ghosts of Christmas past to the screen based on Dickens's description in the book. And the ghost here, like every other adaptation that I've seen, is really weird and visually unappealing. Minor quibbles there. I give it a 10 out of 10. There are some disturbing images with the ghost stuff that might scare the kids, so be advised there if you're a parent. But it's a wonderful adaptation of the classic story, so if you like the Christmas Carol story and you've never seen this rendition, I highly recommend checking it out this season. Up next, highly underrated animated flick, Arthur Christmas. This movie came out in 2011, so this is the newest one on the list so far, and it was basically a flop. It did well in the UK, okay-ish internationally, but terrible in North America. It was a $100 million budget before marketing. It only grossed $47 million over that globally in its entire run. I didn't go see it myself, but I also didn't have kids at the time. Not that that necessarily ever stopped me from going to see an animated film as an adult, but the trailers didn't look particularly interesting. It was a picture made by Sony, who has never been known for its animated offerings, although now with the Spider-Man, animated Spider-Man films, that's kind of shifted a little bit. But it wasn't coming from Disney or DreamWorks, who were the only studios that really seemed to be able to make decent animated flicks, at least sometimes during that period. So I skipped it. And then a year or two later, I watched it at home. I was blown away. It's one of the most interesting, unique spins I've seen on the Santa Claus legend. Instead of Santa being the original Saint Nicholas, who's been alive for hundreds of years, Santa is a position that's passed down from father to son for generations. So you have this multi-generational family of Clauses. You've got Grand Santa, who is voiced by the legendary Bill Nighy. He's super old, he's cantankerous, he's contemptuous of anything new, he's growing senile in his old age. Then you have the current Santa, performed by Jim Broadbent, who is also pretty old. It's time for him to retire, probably should have already retired. He's lost a step, he's outsourced all of his duties to his militant older son, Stephen, voiced by Hugh Laurie. Love Hugh Laurie House, one of my favorite shows of all time. Stephen is this Christmas general who has militarized the elves into an army, and he directs Christmas deliveries from a stealth sky command ship. And he's already Santa in practice, and he's just champing at the bit for his dad to retire so he can officially take on the moniker and become the new Santa. Then there's the title character, Arthur. Arthur is Santa's younger son. He's totally incompetent with the mechanics of Christmas, but he's also the only one in the family who actually still has the childlike joy and spirit of Christmas. So with that setup, the film evolves into an adventure flick with Arthur racing to deliver a missed gift by dawn Christmas morning, just so one child won't wake up and have her faith shattered because Santa didn't deliver her a present. It's got plenty of jokes, a lot of heart, solid 2010s animation that, because it isn't Disney or DreamWorks, it feels fresh and different. The voice cast is stacked, and even though it's made for kids, it's smart enough for parents to enjoy. I give this one a 9 out of 10 and recommend checking it out with the kids this Christmas. Our next to last suggestion, The Man Who Invented Christmas. We've already talked about a version of A Christmas Carol, and in a way, this one is kind of another adaptation, but it's mainly a quirky biopic about the author, Charles Dickens, focusing on the 6 weeks he spent feverishly writing what would become this timeless tale, A Christmas Carol. It's similar to Shakespeare in Love in which we're presented a story that delves into the inspirations surrounding a prolific author's famous work. But this film is far more accurate to the true origin of A Christmas Carol than Shakespeare in Love was to Romeo and Juliet. And what it lacks in accuracy, it makes up for in inventiveness and whimsical delight. It is just phenomenal from top to bottom. Very joyful, ultimately, though there's some darkness in there. It also presents the brilliance and struggles and idiosyncrasies of the creative type better than any film I've seen, and I say this as a creative type. We see Dickens struck by inspiration, immersed, obsessed, rolling through his story like a speeding bullet, only to be stopped abruptly by a random person knocking on his door, breaking his concentration, banishing his muse, and causing unimaginable frustration. And I've been there. If you're a creative type who writes or performs, creates anything, I feel like you'll be able to identify with it. We see him hit a wall, grasp with coming up with names, lines, plot points. And at one point in the film, he says something to the effect of, the characters, they won't do what I want them to do. We also get to see him flesh out the story by interacting with the characters in his mind. And it's here we get to see a version of A Christmas Carol play out. But it's not quite what we're used to seeing because it's a work in progress. And the protagonist, the real character that needs to face his past before fading into a bleak future, isn't Scrooge. It's Dickens himself. And I thought that was just a brilliant, brilliant spin on the tale. It's got a very much a British humor sensibility to it, but there's also a heavy subplot involving Dickens' estranged father, John, who is a deadbeat gentleman. And he's come to London just in time for Christmas. And Charles is just completely embarrassed by it, and he's irritated by it while he's trying to write this story. But his dad is more than a smooth-talking bum. He's a smooth-talking bum that knows his ways are wrong. He knows how he acts and what he does and how he treats people is wrong. And deep down, he feels guilty and ashamed of himself. So how does Charles respond to this lost man who has caused him so much pain in his life? And they go through some of the past of his dad being arrested, thrown in jail, Charles having to go to work as a child labor, hard labor in a shoe black factory. And for anybody that's dealt with friends or family like Charles's father, the subplot hits pretty hard. And the resolution might just make you rethink how to respond to these same kinds of characters that you may have in your life. And even though the movie's almost entirely devoid of parentally objectionable material, there's a curse or two and some scary images, it's made for adults. And I'm not sure if the kids will be interested in this, or at least as interested in this as they would be A Christmas Carol itself. When my wife and I saw it in theaters originally in 2017, we both came out saying, yeah, that was pretty good, 7 out of 10, solid. But the more we watched the film, we've watched it every year since, and every year we like it better and better. And finally this year, after we watched it, I said, you know what, I think this is one of the greatest Christmas movies ever made. Dan Stevens, who plays Charles, is phenomenal. And we've got the legendary Christopher Plummer as a not quite fully formed Scrooge who's ever evolving in Dickens' head, which is just great. I give it a 9 out of 10. And if you like Dickens, if you like A Christmas Carol or quirky British period pieces with a dash of Christmas cheer, go check out The Man Who Invented Christmas. Final film on the list. This is 8-Bit Christmas. This was released in 2021 on HBO Max, and it initially looked like one of those movies that could be absolutely terrible or maybe a passable Christmas watch, maybe a one-time Christmas watch, but it actually surpassed all of my expectations and became an immediate addition to our annual Christmas watch list. It's based on the novel by Kevin Jakubowski, if I pronounced that correctly. It's essentially a Christmas story, but for the 80s generation. So instead of a Red Ryder BB gun, it's an original Nintendo Entertainment System as the gift, as the MacGuffin that the kid's obsessed over and wants to the exclusion of all else. And that's pretty much the gist of the movie. It's as simple as that, but the script is really well written. Steve Zahn really anchors the picture as the dad, much like Darren McGavin did before him in A Christmas Story. You've got Neil Patrick Harris, who brings some gravitas as the adult version of the main character, who's telling the story of his childhood about his quest for the Nintendo to his daughter in 2021. I don't think it's quite as eccentric or endearing enough to become an all-time Christmas classic like Christmas Story, but like the best Christmas movies, it's got some laughs, it tugs at the heartstrings, and ultimately ends on a happy note. And I don't think you could ask for more in this type of Christmas movie. There's a little language, some crude humor, but if you're using a filtering service like ClearPlay, which we use, great service, and they're not sponsoring us, they're not getting any money for this plug. We use it, and it's great. If you use something like that, it doesn't take much to filter it out where it can be a great family experience. If you grew up in the 80s, you'll probably love the period setting and enjoy the aesthetic and cultural references, particularly if you were into video games. I give it an 8 out of 10 and suggest giving it a look. All right, so that'll wrap up the Christmas movie suggestions. Story number 2, year-end story updates. First up, the Beatles' final song. Now and then, the last Beatles song has been released. I covered this on our first episode when it was first announced, and the reporting on this was horrible. Basically, the articles read like Paul McCartney was using AI to create a zombie robot John Lennon. I've said this before, which was not the case at all. What they were actually doing was using an AI tool that was developed by Peter Jackson's team for the Get Back documentary to separate audio into individual elements that could be cleaned and mixed. And what they did for this song is take a poor quality old piano vocal demo that John had recorded on a boombox and, to my understanding, wrote for Paul on it, although I've since heard that it was actually Yoko who wrote for Paul on it later after John died before she gave Paul the tape, so I don't know. They pulled the vocal out of it, cleaned it up, and boom, you got a clean, pristine John Lennon vocal tape. And I actually filmed a live first-time listen to the song and official video on the Randomine Records channel. I'll try to remember to put a link to that in the description so you can go check out my initial thoughts as I'm hearing the song for the first time, checking out the video for the first time. But basically, I thought it was good and I liked it. The technological marvel of hearing John's voice clean and clearly John Lennon was wonderful. Hearing George's guitar from the 90s anthology sessions, also great. Then you got Paul and Ringo doing new overdubs. And it was interesting, but also kind of weird hearing a Beatles track with a clear modern recording sound on the instruments. And that's not what the original Beatles music sounded like because they were recording this in the 60s on that equipment. So that was interesting, also weird, but it was really high production quality. The song itself, and I said this in the reaction, is not a top-tier Beatles song. And I know I got at least one comment that said something along the lines of, well, it may not be top-tier by today's standards, but if this had been released in 1970, it would have been a huge hit. And that type of response has nothing to do with what I said. Absolutely meaningless. First of all, it is a huge hit now. It hit number 7 on Billboard. And even though you could argue it would have charted higher 50 years ago, in terms of the number of people hearing it, it probably got more ears now than it would have then, just because YouTube and Spotify is so ubiquitous and you've got more people checking it out. You've got multi-generations checking it out. Then it was more of the young crowd that was listening to the Beatles. Now you've got the original Beatles fans checking it out. You've got people whose parents raised them on the Beatles checking it out. You've got a new generation who are being introduced to this old music. So I feel like actually more people heard it today than they would have 50 years ago. What I'm talking about whenever I say it's not top tier is the overall songwriting. It's a song about a relationship, about loss, about longing, which is fine. It's great. But John wrote songs with much more meat and depth and interesting lyrics. And there's a possibility that he wrote this about Paul, particularly if he did write for Paul on there. And if so, that elevates it a little bit because it's about the band and about their relationship and that rich history that everybody knows now. But even if he didn't, because John and George have passed, it now retroactively becomes a song about them being missed by Paul and Ringo. And that also makes it more special than it would have been otherwise. I also really enjoyed the video that used the digital technology to insert old footage of John and George into new footage of Paul and Ringo, and young Paul and Ringo with old Paul and Ringo. And it felt very much like the wacky experimental stuff they did in the 60s, and I think John and George would have approved. As a Beatles fan, I'm glad it got released, and if this is the final song, I'm happy to have been here for it. Up next, 2023 box office updates. Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1. We covered a few films this year on the channel, on the show. One was Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning, which I loved, but it kind of flopped domestically. And that was a big shocker for me. $172 million domestically, which puts it at number 13 on the year on the domestic chart. It fared better internationally with a $567 million worldwide total, which puts it at number 8 on the global charts. But it had an estimated budget of around $300 million, and with that high of a budget, $567 worldwide, $172 domestic is not a good showing at all. I'm not 100% sure why it didn't perform better. I thought it was really well done, highly rated among both critics and audiences. I was expecting positive word of mouth to propel it beyond the opening weekend. It's a Tom Cruise franchise actioner, and Tom's last movie, Top Gun Maverick, was in a similar vein, and it single-handedly saved the box office last year. So I was expecting something similar here with the box office numbers. If for nothing else, just coming off the goodwill that was created by Top Gun Maverick. But we must have been too far removed from Top Gun's release. I feel like if this had been ready to go last Thanksgiving or Christmas 2022, when everybody was still hyped from Top Gun, it would have fared much better domestically. I could be totally wrong there, but that's the feeling I get. I remember, I think the trailer actually played in front of Top Gun Maverick. The trailer for Mission Impossible played in front of Top Gun Maverick. And after Top Gun Maverick ended, I came out of there going like, man, all right, when's that Mission Impossible coming out? Because I like Top Gun Maverick so much. It was also followed by Barbie and Oppenheimer less than 2 weeks later, which was the movie event of the year. Like, that's not even arguable. There was nothing else that even compared to the Barbenheimer weekend. So any legs that Dead Reckoning may have had would have been cut off at the knees by those two movies. It's also a symptom of the post-pandemic era. There are so many options on streaming, and people have become so accustomed to watching from home. Plus, you got theater to streaming release windows are so short now that a film really has to strike the target audience as a must-see immediately type release to post the kinds of numbers we had got used to seeing in the last 20 years. And now you've got like a 45-day window between theatrical release and home streaming release. So unless it's something that really grabs people's attention, that they have to go see it in theaters right now, a lot of people are now just waiting 45 days for the home video release. And for whatever reason, Dead Reckoning just was not that type of film this year. Up next, Oppenheimer. I mentioned Oppenheimer earlier, which I did not like. I know I'm in a minority, just did not do it for me. And I said so on the show, clipped it on YouTube, and I got a bunch of keyboard warriors smashing that dislike button. I guess they're mouse warriors or phone tap warriors smashing that dislike button instead of actually doing something productive with their lives. But anyway, even though I didn't like it, it did incredible business. Number 5 domestic box office, number 3 globally, and I got to say, I don't get it. I get a good box office show in the first week because a lot of people like me who love movies and didn't care anything about Barbie, but love Christopher Nolan and biopics and epic historical dramas and Cillian Murphy, we're going to go see that opening weekend. But I honestly thought that more people would hate this movie and it would start getting poor word of mouth after opening weekend and then just get destroyed by Barbie. But nope. International smash. Congratulations to Christopher Nolan and everybody involved. And maybe his next movie will have similar success and be more my cup of tea. All right, last movie we covered on the show, Sound of Freedom. This was another smash. $184 million domestically, $248 globally, number 10 on the domestic list. And I didn't put the global list number on my notes, but I think it was number 21 globally. Domestically, that puts it ahead of Taylor Swift Eras concert film, Indiana Jones, Mission Impossible, Transformers, Creed, Elemental, Fast X, Hunger Games, Scream, The Flash, Dungeons & Dragons, and The Marvels domestically on the year. And that's against a $15 million budget, limited release, and 4 years of post-production limbo. That makes it one of the most profitable indie films of all time. It was a good movie. Really hard watch, but it's an important subject matter, and I'm glad it has enjoyed the success that it has. Finally, a roundup on the other big films this year. Barbie, which I already mentioned, but I have not seen, topped both the domestic and global box offices with $636 million and $1.4 billion, respectively. Super Mario Brothers, which I have seen and thought was excellent. I went with my oldest daughter. We loved it. We've watched it I don't know how many times now that it's on streaming. It hit number 2 on both charts with $574 million and $1.4 billion. Superhero films, which had been my favorite subgenre of speculative fiction for about 2 decades, have begun to struggle as a genre, but a few cracked the top 10 of both charts. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse landed at number 3 domestically with $381 million and number 6 internationally with $690. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 ended at number 4 on both charts with $359 million and $845 million respectively. And Ant-Man 3 landed at numbers 8 and 10 with $214 and $476 million. And I have seen none of these films. And I plan to talk more about that in the new year. So stay tuned. And that is the box office roundup for 2023. All right, last story update. Gargoyles greenlit for live action series. There was a report that came out during the summer that Gargoyles, which is Disney's cult sci-fi fantasy series from the 90s, it's also my favorite show of all time, was finally getting the live action big screen treatment with Shakespearean powerhouse Kenneth Branagh in the director's chair. We covered this on the show. On paper, it sounded great. I was cautiously excited. Well, apparently, Not only will Kenneth Branagh not be involved at all, he's not directing, he's not producing anything, but the live action reboot won't be a movie, but instead will be a Disney Plus series produced by horror guru James Wan. And like I said, I was initially cautiously optimistic when the report first came out. Now I am not excited at all and wish they would just leave well enough alone. I could be wrong, but besides a series adaptation seeming completely pointless because, we already have the series and it was nearly perfect, Disney Plus speculative fiction series have been consistently lackluster and have just been getting worse. They debuted strong with The Mandalorian Season 1. I had some issues with it. I thought that there were some kind of fillerific episodes. They could have cut those and made it a more streamlined narrative. Overall, I thought it was really good. It really leaned into the Western roots of Star Wars. After that, Season 2 of The Mandalorian, they doubled down on the fillers for me. It was okay. After that, you had Book of Boba Fett, which was predominantly the first half of the season was terrible. Then they basically turned it into a season 2.5 of The Mandalorian, so it picked up a little bit, but even still, not that great. Obi-Wan really just turned me off of the Star Wars Disney Plus series completely. It undercut so much of the original trilogy of the relationship between Obi-Wan and Darth Vader, and undercut some of the prequel trilogy too. The best part of the prequel trilogy, which was their relationship in Revenge of the Sith, I felt like it was some really bad writing, some contrived plot points. I dropped Star Wars series completely after Obi-Wan. The Marvel series haven't fared much better. WandaVision, I really enjoyed the classic sitcom motif because I grew up on classic sitcoms. I love those shows, but that kind of wore off after a while, particularly when they passed like the 70s, for me personally. And then the ending really was kind of overblown and really just didn't click for me. Falcon and Winter Soldier, the first half of the season, like 3 or 4 episodes, I thought were fairly well done. Could have trimmed them down a little bit, but after that, it was just complete nosedive. I thought the finale was one of the worst finales I've seen. Loki had some interesting stuff going on. Again, a lot of filler. I didn't finish season 1. I've been told I need to go watch the last 2 episodes, but I just not that interested. I haven't watched season 2. Hawkeye, I didn't think was really good at all. Moon Knight, I liked overall, but again, a lot of filler. When it got toward the end, it didn't really stick as well as the earlier episodes had. So I just don't have much hope for them being able to pull this off. Plus, with James Wan, I know he's dabbled in other aspects of the speculative fiction genre. He's done Aquaman. I think he's doing Aquaman 2. But the fact that he's involved in this makes me think that they're going to lean into horror for this show. And that's something that's been suggested for a Gargoyles live action adaptation from years. And I'm not really sure why. It's not a smart move. Because, yeah, even though the stars of the show, the main characters, are these monstrous winged creatures, any fan or anybody that's watched the show for any length of time will tell you the story doesn't lend itself to horror. Sci-fi, sure. Fantasy, absolutely. Shakespearean drama, 100%, which is why I was so stoked that Kenneth Branagh was going to be involved or might be involved. But horror, absolutely not. So that makes me think automatically that if James Wan's involved, it makes me think they're leaning horror. And if they're leaning horror, it makes me think they don't get the property. I also don't see them shelling out the bucks necessary to do the story justice because the original, you had, first of all, the creatures, you're going to need some heavy practical effects and probably some CG, at least for the flying sequences. But in addition to the fantasy stuff that's going to require some practical effects and some CG, It takes place in two timelines, so you've got 1,000 years ago and then today, or if they said it in the 90s, which I really don't even see how you can separate Gargoyles from the 90s, because it's not the same story in the age of cell phones. A really good friend of mine made the comment one time that you can't really write any great story set in the time after the proliferation of cell phones. Because everybody can talk to everybody. Everybody can film everything. So you have to come up with contrivances to work around that to make a really, really great story. So regardless of when it's set, if it's anything like the series, the original series, there is a lot of technology, a lot of sci-fi technology, high-tech gear, armor, all that. It's going to take a high budget to make it look realistic. I don't see them shelling out that for an unproven reboot of a 30-year-old animated series property for Disney Plus. And I might be wrong, but unless Disney hires writers who understand classical storytelling and will stay true to the essence of the original, I think we're in for another dismal streaming series from the Mouse House. All right, so that's going to be all the time we have for this episode. I really wanted to get to a couple of comments. I answered most comments already, but I started in episode 3 trying to do the EOV Club in the video club, where we answer fan comments, something that started originally on our Randomine Records channel. But the last episode, it was an interview, so we didn't do it then. Now I'm running short on time. We also didn't really have a whole lot of comments, and I responded to most of those already. But stay tuned. Next year, whenever we come back in January, y'all comment on this video, comment on any clips that are released, any trailer reactions we did, and in January, I hope we film the next episode, record the next episode, and try to get to a couple of those comments on our End of Video Club special segment where we talk to the audience. And I hope everybody has a Merry Christmas, a Happy New Year, and we'll see you in January.
Like that, words like that.